Hey folks, so some new data just dropped on psychedelic use in the United States, specifically with microdosing. This is actually from RAND, rand.org. I'll drop a link in the comments below, and it talks about insights from a probability-based and nationally representative survey. So the key findings from the research that was published, the top 5 psychedelic substances used by U.S. adults in the past year were psilocybin, mushrooms, obvious, MDMA, makes sense, Amanita muscaria mushrooms. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. I don't know if this is actually a psychedelic, so this is more an issue with the research than anything. Ketamine, okay, is that a psychedelic? Maybe, and then LSD, an actual real psychedelic. Psilocybin was the most used psychedelic substances, with approximately 11 million U.S. adults using it in 2025, which is an increase from 2023 when 8 million U.S. adults used it. So we've seen in just 2 years, use increased by almost 40% with psilocybin mushrooms, which is impressive. And I think is a good note for the approval of psilocybin by the FDA coming later this year, which we'll get into in a little bit. Now, approximately 10 million U.S. adults microdosed psilocybin, LSD, or MDMA in the past year. Psilocybin, LSD, great. Let's talk a little bit about why MDMA might be a problem. Among U.S. adults who used psilocybin in the past year, 69% microdosed at least once during that period. And the aggregated number of days that U.S. adults used psilocybin in the past year exceeded 200 million. And nearly half of these days involved microdosing. Let's talk about those last 2 points. So in 2023, RAND published this same report, and it was 47% of adults who had taken psilocybin had also microdosed at least once during that period. That number has now jumped to 69%, which means in just 2 years, the prevalence of microdosing is clearly growing. And we also see this in this last point, that nearly half of these days that people took psychedelics involved microdosing. Now, what's interesting to me about this find, if you will, is that there's not a lot of good clinical data yet around microdosing, right? I'm a huge microdosing fan. I think when it's done with intention, when it's done as a synergistic practice with meditation or breath work or yoga or whatever else, it can be really useful. In fact, we have a microdosing practitioner certification where we train people in our microdosing protocol. So I love microdosing. And I think it's really unfortunate that there is a lack of clear clinical evidence around microdosing thus far. And yet, in spite of that, we know that a lot of people are starting to microdose, right? They're not waiting until the clinical evidence gives them the thumbs up. They're saying, I've heard about psychedelics quite a bit. I know these can be useful tools if used with intention, and I'm not going to jump right in the deep end right away. Instead, I'm going to ease my way in overall, so it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. And so they're choosing microdosing. And it's funny, this is sort of my hypothesis back in 2015 when we started Third Wave was, let's lead with microdosing, because the quickest way to get a mass populace interested in these substances is not to potentially overwhelm their system, but to get them to start low and go slow. And that's something you've heard me talk about, you'll continue to hear me talk a lot about, is this notion of start low and go slow. All right, let's go back to some of the data that came out. So first of all, Amanita muscaria, qualifying it as a psychedelic substance feels a little meh, From what I understand, most people who are taking Amanita muscaria are either doing so in these sort of gas station chocolate bars. So another really interesting element of this current third wave of psychedelics is, even though all of these are Schedule I substances at the federal level still, and even though they're not legal in most states even, we've seen a couple states, Colorado and Oregon, who have legalized it, they are all over the place now in smoke shops. Mushroom chocolates, right? Or mushroom capsules. Sometimes there's psilocybin in them. Sometimes there's a synthetic psilocybin analog. And oftentimes there's Amanita in it. And this is tricky because the actual experience of Amanita is nothing at all like a classic psilocybin experience. And this is part of the, I would say, problem with the rise of interest in psychedelics and the lack of regulation to some degree, and lack of education for that matter. And I know there are a lot of people who are taking Amanita who are just doing it to help with anxiety. They're doing it in tincture form. All of the psychedelic properties have been removed. So I'm not sure if qualifying or counting Amanita as a true psychedelic is, all that useful in this case. Okay, let's get to the second point that I was going to hit on, which was the widespread use of MDMA microdosing and why this is a bad idea. So LSD, psilocybin microdosing, even wachuma microdosing, which I talked a little bit about earlier, perfectly good, perfecly fine. These are 5-HT2A serotonergic agonists. They can be used consistently over a long period of time. There's various benefits around these substances related to the anti-inflammatory properties, related to neurogenesis, related to energy and vitality, right? Microdosing, the classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, wachuma, great. There are also quite a few people who are now exploring iboga or ibogaine as a microdosing solution, particularly after a flood dose, or maybe even to help with things like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's if someone's a little scared to jump in the deep end with iboga. But microdosing MDMA, we really advise against. And that's for a few reasons. It can be neurotoxic and also have not so great cardiovascular effects. It can be addictive and it can be easily abused. The other consideration is that a lot of the clinical research that we have so far really points to the efficacy of therapeutic doses of MDMA, which would be anywhere from 80 to 120 milligrams. Doing MDMA in that way every 2 or 3 months, perfectly safe. What I would advise is a supplementation regimen to mitigate some of the neurotoxicity associated with MDMA. But I love MDMA. I love doing it with my girlfriend. I love doing it with dear friends and close friends of mine. It's a beautiful medicine, but I really advise against the microdosing of it because it feels really good, it's really nice, and the just trade-offs are not worth it. And so it is concerning to me that we're seeing such a huge rise of interest in microdosing MDMA in particular. In fact, I'll pull this document back up once again. And if we look at some of these, this is a cool chart. So past year use of psychedelic substances by adults in the US, psilocybin at 4%, MDMA or MDA just under 2%, Amanita, ketamine, LSD, DMT, mescaline, the alkaloid in wachuma and peyote, 2CB, salvia, iboga, or ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT. There are also some numbers here, which are fun to review, and you could take a look at that if you want. But it shows that there are literally now tens of millions of people who are taking psychedelics in the United States, which is exciting. Now, there's also probably some overlap here, right? So a lot of people who are taking psilocybin are also taking MDMA. They're also taking ketamine. They may also be taking LSD, right? They may also then be taking 2CB, right? So there might be a little bit of overlap. It's not like these are all individual use cases, but still, there's clearly probably at least 15 to 20 million people who are taking psychedelics in the United States, which is fantastic. So this is what I was pointing to. Estimated proportion of U.S. adults who microdosed psilocybin, MDMA, or LSD. MDMA, they reported microdosing at least once. It's 65%, right? Which is fairly high, especially when much of the efficacy of MDMA comes from these high doses. So I'd really advise against that. And then estimated proportion of microdosing use days in the past year for MDMA, 42% of people, who say they're taking MDMA are doing it while microdosing, which again, I just cannot say is good. Like, don't be microdosing MDMA, folks. It's not a good idea. All right, so that's the breakdown from 2025, the RAND report. Huge numbers, 11 million Americans have tried psilocybin mushrooms. 69% of those reported microdosing at least once. Microdosing is clearly on the rise. It's just going to continue to rise. And I think that the last bow that I'll tie here is this is exciting news coming into 2026 because the FDA has slated approval of synthetic psilocybin, also called Comp 360 from Compass Pathways, for the end of 2026. So the fact that 11 million people have already taken mushrooms in the United States shows there's a strong appetite, and also shows, there's not going to be a ton of work that needs to be done. Comp 360, once it gets approved, if and when it gets approved, it's going to come out of the bat. And as long as there's reasonable health insurance coverage for it, there's going to be a huge uptake on it. And I think that's exciting. There are people who are really struggling who need this medicine who can only go right now to underground providers or gas stations to get it. We need more options. And so I, for one, am so excited about the prevalence of psychedelic use in the United States and the fact that our institutions are now catching up, and that hopefully this year we'll see the first ever approved psychedelic medicine by the FDA. All right. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, share it with someone who you think might enjoy the breakdown that we did, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.